Externalities. Externalities is something that we have been seeing throughout this course in many situations, even in the problems you faced, but we had never discussed it more in depth. And this is the moment, the appropriate moment to do so because of the idea of market failures and because literally the COVID pandemic is a huge externality on society. And the way people react to the pandemic creates externalities. So an externality can be positive or negative, depending on if it creates benefits to third parties or it creates harms. And therefore, you can describe an externality as a direct effect of the actions of some economic agent on the well-being of another economic agent. So think of it. The more people that are basically not staying at home and moving around the cities and probably or possibly getting contaminated and therefore getting sick with coronavirus, those people will eventually end up, some of them will eventually end up in the hospital. Some of them can be contagious to other people that come in contact with them, and more people can end up in the hospital. And if more people end up in the hospital at the same time, you oversaturate the health system, and people die because things that could have been in technically cured or at least treated with a different equipment in the hospital, if there's insufficient at that moment because all of the beds are full and the ventilators and stuff like that, all of them are full, you can't treat that person and those people die. That is why governments decided to shut down the economies and like send people home. And when you see people like Ricardo Salinas Pliego yesterday saying that people should just leave home and understand that they can do so once se desapendejen, que fue su término tal cual en el tweet, he's literally creating a negative externality on society because with his platforms and his social media scope, he's attempting to convince people to go out before it's technically safe to go out. And when it's technically safe to go out depends on every region of the country. Every country has its own measures and its own timetable. But the point is that an externality is caused every time you create some effect on a third party, whether they are positive or negative. So a couple of examples of negative and positive externalities. Negative externalities include things like pollution, that like the pollution produced by a firm that is doing some process regarding with water or regarding with air pollution affects the environment and affects the air we can breathe or the drinking water we have and stuff like that. So that's a negative externality. Smoking can have a bunch of negative externalities on people because we know of secondhand smoking or the passive smokers that like their spouses or their siblings or whomever, their friends are smoking. And even if I'm not smoking and I'm receiving the smoke, your lungs get affected in some capacity. That is a negative externality on your health. Free riding, we discussed this idea of like not paying for your services. Basically, stealing electricity increases the load on everyone else, and you have to pay higher electricity costs because some people are basically not paying their fair share. Some positive externalities are things that create something better for society. And the best example is vaccination. The moment people decide not to get vaccines for their children, they are making it simpler for them to get contaminated and get sick of some things like measles or like things that like have essentially disappeared from like developed countries, and suddenly some people like the anti-vaxxers decided to not get the vaccines for their children, and now more people have this disease because there are certain people that by birth and by their genetics are have immune system deficiencies and can get vaccinated. So they are counting on others, counting on us to be vaccinated so that the probability that they will get into contact with someone sick of this thing will be much lower, sorry, because more people have been vaccinated. Other examples are education. The more educated people are, the better decision that a society takes, the less they fall for stupid decisions from the government or stuff like that. And also, the use of public transportation. implies less traffic, and with less traffic, people get faster to work, and also less pollution. So the idea of the negative externality, which is the most common one and the one that we need to address through some policy intervention, is that the costs generated by the externality are not being taken into account by the people creating that externality. And this is why you have a negative externality. The firm or the plant that is polluting the river through their production process is not taking into account that that polluted water can affect downstream the other industries like farmers or even the drinking water of some population of society. And they are not paying for that cost or the cost associated to this pollution or these externalities that third parties are having to pay in terms of like cleaning the water for drinking purposes or not being able to use that water for their crops or for their livestock and having to bring water from other places, and that is much more costly, increasing the price of your products. All of those type of things should be paid by the people creating that externality. In order to model this, what we do in economics is that we differentiate between the private cost and the social cost. And the private cost is essentially the firm's production cost that we have seen since like months ago. But the social cost is a new concept that essentially considers the damages done to the community and their costs on their activities. So it's basically a combination of two costs: the cost or the marginal cost of production of the firm, plus the extra added damages or extra added costs that others have to endure because of this. And I think the next slide is actually a graph. Yes. So what happens here is that if we want to model the original equilibrium, we need to see a couple of things here. So at the beginning, in a case where there's no basically accounting of the social marginal cost, what happens is that you have a demand for the production of whatever good this is, and this firm produces it. So the firm's marginal cost of production, MCP, the private marginal cost of production, is let's call it peach line, a peach diagonal line that reads MCP. And where those two lines, the blue line and the peach line intersect, you find the original equilibrium EC, in which you basically have the unregulated market. So once you have the original equilibrium, the one that where the MCP line intersects the demand curve, that is just what the firm is considering into their production function, and determined by those costs, they decide the price at which they're going to basically price their good and the overall equilibrium quantity. So in this case, the equilibrium quantity for that decision is PC equals $240, whatever this is. Yeah, $240 per ton of paper production. And they produce the equilibrium quantity of 105 tons of paper. But what happens is that in this case, the production of paper affects others. And it may well be that they are affecting water supply or something that affects other people in the neighboring areas. So there's actually an additional cost. The pink line on the lower part of the graph that reads MCG is basically the marginal cost of the group or of the community that particular book called it G. I would have called it like community or others or whatever. But the point is that there's an additional marginal cost that is not being taken into account by the firm. And when you actually do so, you find that you have a new marginal cost. In this case, the red line that reads the social marginal cost. And the social marginal cost, as we just described, is the combination of the private marginal cost that the firm incurs, and the one you've always known how to calculate, and the group's marginal cost. But the point is that you actually find a social marginal cost that shows you the real based not only the real cost on society, but also where the optimal equilibrium should be. So you have a new equilibrium, in this case ES, that shows you that there is, or basically to cover these extra costs on society, the price of that good should be higher. It should be $282 per ton of paper. And because of this higher price, the overall quantity sold at the market should be lower, should be just 84 tons instead of the 105. So what we have here is two different equilibriums. The one that the firm sees and wants to address based on their own internal decisions, their cost functions, and the one that is the optimal for society. Climate change is full of this type of dual equilibriums in which the amount of production of one thing is too much than what actually society needs. And because you have too much, you have effects, in this case, on the environment. So the point is that, as you can see in the graph, because of this divergence and the extra quantity being produced greater than what it should be produced, the difference between the 105 and the 84 in the bottom of the graph, you create a triangle labeled E on the graph, which is a deadweight loss triangle. You are producing in excess of what is socially optimal, and therefore you are wasting resources. That is the explanation behind that deadweight loss. Negative externalities always create deadweight loss. The size of that deadweight loss obviously depends on the particularities of those demand and supply curves, or those demand and the marginal cost curves. And as we saw in previous classes, they are determined, the size of that deadweight loss and the overall effect on society is determined by the elasticities of these curves. Any questions up to here on what externalities are and basically what they mean with regards to the deadweight loss? Therefore, if we have a deadweight loss, we have to address it. Normally, when you have deadweight losses, it is the unequivocal signal that the government or some regulatory body should intervene to correct that deadweight loss. How do you think could be a good way of correcting this deadweight loss? How can we, from the previous classes and the things you've learned in this course, how do you think, or what do you think could be done? What type of policy could be done that decreases the quantity available in the market?
Taxes.
Taxes is the simplest way of correcting this. We've known from the previous class on taxes and in general tax discussion we've had during the entire course that taxes have distort the market, increase prices, and because they increase prices, because of the substitution effect and the law of the demand, you have essentially a reduced quantity. Less people want to buy that. And if you do this, if you charge or levy a tax on this, you can essentially reduce the deadweight loss. And the idea is, and the optimal regulatory policy would be create a tax that is the correct amount that reduces the quantity being produced to the socially optimal quantity. And if we see this next graph, this is just that idea. Taxes to control pollution. There's all kinds of taxes regarding the environment. Carbon taxes are the most famous ones, but there are others, and they can be applied to different types of things. So what you do here is that recall from the previous graph in which the equilibrium of the market was the 105 tons of paper at the 240 dollar price, and what this society or this market needs is a decrease of 21 tons. So to decrease those 21 tons, you need to move the equilibrium from EC to ES. So basically you want to place a tax which is the size of the deadweight loss. And that is what happens exactly here. So what is created is a tax, or if we did actually this problem in the math way, like the numerical, the algebraic model, what we would find is that the appropriate tax would be a tax of $84 per ton. being produced that would decrease this production of paper in such a way that you actually reach the socially optimal quantity, because you want only 84 tons. And to get that, you need to increase the marginal cost of production at that point, which would be $198 would be this particular marginal cost of private marginal cost of production. And if you add those $84, you get to the social optimal price of 282. So if we piece it backwards, what happens more or less in these cases is that you, from the original case or the original scenario, you find what is the optimal social equilibrium, ES, and we find what is the quantity, and we find what is the price. And from that price, we basically introduce a tax the size that allows you to reduce the overall externality. And if the overall externality is, in this case, $84, we only subtract 84 from the 292. We find basically what is the particular private marginal cost at that point. And with that, we would find the appropriate tax level. Any questions as we basically finish the main idea behind externalities?